Every day, hundreds of people flock to the Capitol in Washington, D.C., attracted only by power.
You're going to have political action committees who are unable.
Any letters or constituency mail?
That power has accumulated here over the past 50 years at the seat of government of the most powerful nation on earth.
Bill Hendricks from my staff.
How do you do? Glad to meet you.
See you.
How are you?
What are you talking about? Guns? Hello, this is Warren Richardson. Oh, Mary, yes. What's on your mind?
Warren Richardson makes his living by knowing who has power and influence to trade.
Get the word. I'll be here waiting for you.
He's a lobbyist.
Thanks a lot. Bye.
The official administration position on this bill, however, is that its consideration would be premature at this time in view of the president's...
He trades with people like these, members of the House Committee on Agriculture. They make some of the laws and regulations that, among other things, control the food we eat. They are elected officials who have the power to spend billions of dollars of our tax money.
We always took them out. And it takes all of page 2 and it takes all of page 3.
Naturally, lots of people would like to get their hands on that money.
That's the kind of stuff that ought never go into the statute books. And I think anybody who is practicing the justice court knows it.
You know, the way you get common sense administration is by having common sense administrators. And I feel like there's more common sense administration in agriculture.
Access is all important. And how you gain access. It used to be that there are only maybe a few hundred lobbyists in this town. Now we record up to 15,000 lobbyists, plus ancillary personnel of secretaries, receptionists, and typists. And the researchers that go with that. They're calling upon all the law firms imaginable. So there's a tremendous support base out there for the lobbying effort.
You don't have to walk these corridors very long before you begin to realize that the concentration of power in the hands of a few people, however well-intentioned, is a real threat to the freedom of the individual. Of course, Warren Richardson doesn't see it that way. Over the years, he's successfully lobbied for special interest groups in energy, environment, wages, and prices. Today, he's arguing the case for another special interest, the National Action Committee on Labor Law Reform, hoping to swing influence his way.
The bill goes overboard in terms of... Much, much too far.
There's hardly a time when the corridors of congressional office buildings are not peppered with people waiting for their chance to see and influence the elected men at the center of power.
Set aside within that legislation for funds for communities of 50,000 and under, the goals of the existing law and certain statutory paperwork requirements are often very unrealistic for smaller communities.
The deals made here affect all of us, and sometimes in ways we don't like. But don't blame the people making the deals. They're just pursuing their own self-interest, which may be as narrow as making a buck or as broad as trying to reform the world. We, the citizens, are to blame because we've handed over so much of our lives, our personal decision-making to government. And we now find that what government does severely limits our freedom. The leather and wood-paneled official offices of a congressman in Washington, D.C. It's the mecca of those who try for behind-the-scenes influence.
The acknowledgement of the letter.
Weaving his way between special interest groups can be tough for a politician. To stay in office, he needs votes. To get votes, he often has to make deals.
The chances of our party regaining the White House, if Republicans, if the president sends up policies that Republicans can support.
It's frequently a frustrating business.
So when you have people who are coming in not for purposes of debate and dialogue and discussion on something, but merely they demand their special interest or their single issue concern, that's where it becomes extremely difficult because there might be an equal number on the opposite side of the coin.
Every time I come to Washington, I'm impressed all over again with how much power is concentrated in this city. But we must understand the character of that power. It is not monolithic power in a few hands, the way it is in countries like the Soviet Union or Red China. It is fragmented into lots of little bits and pieces, with every special group around the country trying to get its hand on whatever bits and pieces it can. The result is that there's hardly an issue in which you won't find government on both sides. For example, in one of these massive buildings scattered all through this town, filled to the bursting with government employees, some of them are sitting around trying to figure out how to spend our money to discourage us from smoking cigarettes. In another of the massive buildings, maybe far away from the first, some other employees, equally dedicated, equally hardworking, are sitting around figuring out how to spend our money to subsidize farmers to grow more tobacco. In one building, they're figuring out how to hold down prices. In another building, they've got schemes for raising prices, the prices farmers receive, or import prices, or keeping out cheap foreign goods. We set up an enormous Department of Energy with 20,000 employees to encourage us to save energy. We set up an enormous Department of Environmental Protection to figure out ways to get cleaner air involving our using more energy. Now, many of these effects cancel out, but that doesn't mean that these programs don't do a great deal of harm and that there aren't some very bad things about it. One thing you can be sure of, the costs don't cancel out, they add together. Each of these programs spends money taken from our pockets that we could be using to buy goods and services to meet our separate needs. All of these programs use very able, very skilled people who could be doing productive things. They all of them grind out rules, regulations, red tape, forms to fill in. I doubt that there's a person in this country who doesn't violate one or another of those rules or regulations or laws every day. Not because he wants to or intends to, but simply because it's impossible for anybody to know what they all are. Those are the bad things. But there's something good about this fragmentation of power, too. And that is that it enables us to do something about it. If power were really concentrated and monolithic in a few hands, it'd be hopeless to reform the system. But because it's fragmented, because it's split up, we can see how much waste there is, we can see how inefficient it is, how the left hand seldom knows what the right hand is doing.
It wasn't always like this. The armies of bureaucrats administering our lives, making our decisions, spending our money, all supposedly for our good. Our nation was founded with something fundamentally different in mind.
Almost 200 years ago, a remarkable group of men gathered in this room to write a constitution for the new nation that they had helped to create a few years earlier. They were a wise and learned group of people. They had learned the lesson of history. The great danger to freedom is a concentration of power, especially in the hands of a government. They were determined to protect the citizens of the new United States of America from that danger. And they crafted their Constitution with that in mind. That Constitution has served us well. It has enabled us to preserve our freedom for close on to 200 years. But in the past 50 years, we have been forgetting the lesson that the wise men knew so well. From regarding government as a threat to our freedom, we have come more and more to regard government as a benefactor from which all good things flow. We have assigned increasing tasks of great importance to government. We have turned over to government a larger and larger fraction of our income to be spent on our behalf. And the results are plain for all to see. They are disappointing. The great expectations have not been achieved, and our freedoms have suffered in the process.
Where did it all go wrong? government began to take an increasing part in our personal affairs nearly 50 years ago. It was 1933, at the lowest point of the worst depression in history. The idea took root that capitalism had failed, and that failure was responsible for the human and economic tragedy. In the early 30s, Franklin Delano Roosevelt and his advisors met here to devise programs to meet the problems of the Depression. Their answer was to give central government more power. Out of that beginning came today's welfare state. This Empire State Plaza in Albany, New York is a fine example of the difference between public political power and private economic power. It was constructed while Nelson Rockefeller was governor of the state of New York. The Rockefeller family has spent millions of its private money on good causes. It has endowed universities like my own at the University of Chicago, financed medical research, reconstructed Williamsburg. Yet not all the private money of the Rockefeller family gave them anything like the amount of power that Nelson Rockefeller was able to have as governor of the state of New York. He constructed monuments like this all over the state, using every expedient he could think of to finance them. When he left office, taxes per person in New York State were higher than in any other state in the country, excepting only Alaska. And there was a monumental debt besides. So much so that his successor, who had the reputation as a Democratic congressman of being a big spender, had to use his inaugural speech to preach the virtues of austerity and to say, the time of wine and roses is over. Look at this skyline. It's Chicago, and I think it's very beautiful. Much of it is less than 20 years old. Those tall buildings were built by private enterprise for use by private enterprise, not by government for use by government bureaucrats. These are productive monuments, not a burden on the taxpayer, a burden that has almost bankrupted New York City. The irony is that for the most part it was good intentions that led us to where we are today, a nation governed by bureaucratic empires. I wonder whether, when they built this building, they realized that it was going to come out looking like a fortress. From modest beginnings in 1953, the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare has grown into a veritable empire. Only a small part of its total staff is housed in this headquarters building, a mere 2,000 bureaucrats. Its budget is the third largest budget in the whole world, exceeded only by the entire budget of the United States and of the Soviet Union.